Black photographer captures moment that changes his life. The camera flash illuminated the chaos for just a fraction of a second. In that frozen moment, James Wilson saw everything with perfect clarity. The young man lunging forward through the wall of smoke, arms outstretched toward the elderly woman who had fallen. The protest had turned violent just minutes before, and now tear gas clouded the air. James's finger pressed the shutter release again and again, his old photographer's instincts taking over despite the burning in his eyes and throat. The young man reached the woman, shielding her body with his own as a line of riot police advanced. James captured it all, the determination on the rescuer's face, the relief of the woman, the ominous wall of shields and batons closing in. It was only when the young man turned, helping the woman to her feet, that James saw his face clearly for the first time in 3 years. "Michael," James whispered, his camera lowering slightly. The world seemed to stop. His son, his estranged son, was there in the middle of it all, staring back at him with equal shock. The officer's baton came down hard, catching Michael across the shoulders. He crumpled to his knees beside the woman he'd tried to save. James screamed his son's name, the camera falling to his chest as he lunged forward, only to be caught and restrained by other protesters. "Let me through, that's my son." James struggled against the hands holding him back as officers surrounded Michael and the woman. "Michael!" But let's go back to how this all started. It was just 3 hours earlier when James Wilson packed his camera bag in the quiet of his small apartment studio. After 40 years as a photojournalist, his hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking each lens, securing spare batteries, and testing his flash. At 65, James had covered everything from the fall of Saigon to Hurricane Katrina, but these days he mostly taught photography at the community college and did occasional freelance work for local publications. James's apartment walls were covered with framed photographs, moments of history he had captured over decades. Most prominent was his Pulitzer-winning image from 1968, a young black boy standing resolute before a line of National Guardsmen during the riots following Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. The photo had made James's career, but lately he found himself wondering what had become of that boy, now a man in his 60s like himself. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. James glanced at the caller ID and hesitated when he saw his wife's name, Diana. They had been separated for nearly a year now, though neither had filed for divorce. "Hello," James answered, tucking the phone between his ear and shoulder as he continued packing. "James, are you watching the news?" Diana's voice had the tight, controlled quality it always took on when she was worried. "No, I've been preparing for this afternoon. What's happening?" "There's a protest downtown about the police shooting last week. It's getting big, James, and Michael posted on Facebook that he's there." James's hands stilled on his camera. Michael, their son. They hadn't spoken since that terrible argument 3 years ago when Michael had accused James of caring more about documenting the world's pain than dealing with his own family's problems. "I thought you should know," Diana continued when James didn't respond. "In case you're heading downtown for work." "I am," James said quietly. "The Tribune asked me to get some shots." "James," Diana paused, "be careful, and if you see him." "I'll be careful," James said, not committing to anything regarding their son. After they hung up, he sat heavily in his chair, staring at the family photo on his desk from 15 years ago, Michael's high school graduation. They had been happy then, before the arguments, before Michael had gone to law school and become an activist, before James had missed one too many anniversaries and birthdays because he was always chasing the next important story. James finished packing with renewed purpose. He hadn't known Michael would be at the protest, but now it seemed like fate was giving him an opportunity. Maybe, just maybe, he could reconnect with his son today. Robert called over the noise of the crowd, grinning as he approached. At 70, Robert was even older than James, his white hair contrasting sharply with his dark skin. "Could say the same about you," James replied with a smile, clasping his friend's hand. "Diana said the Tribune wanted coverage." Robert's eyebrows rose. "You still talking to Diana? That's progress," James shrugged. "We never stopped talking, just stopped living together." "And Michael, any word from him?" James hesitated. "Diana says he's here today. Have you seen him?" Robert shook his head. "Haven't seen him, but there are thousands here. Listen, James," he was interrupted by a sudden surge in the crowd as people pressed forward toward the police line that had formed in front of the courthouse steps. "Something's happening," James said, his journalist instincts taking over. "I'm going to get closer." Robert grabbed his arm. "Be careful. These things can turn on a dime. Remember Chicago '68? James nodded grimly. He'd been just a teenager then, but the images of that chaotic democratic convention were seared into his memory, his first understanding of how quickly peace could descend into violence. James made his way toward the front of the crowd, where protesters were face-to-face with officers in riot gear. The tension was palpable. He raised his camera, focusing on a young woman speaking intensely to an officer who seemed to be listening despite his impassive expression. Click. The shutter captured the moment, humanity on both sides of a divide. As James continued taking photos, he scanned the crowd for Michael. His son would be 35 now, and James realized with a pang that he might not even recognize him. The last photo he had was from Michael's law school graduation 7 years ago. So much could change in that time. The speeches began from a makeshift platform. Community leaders, family members of victims, and local activists took turns with the megaphone. James photographed them all, moving methodically through the crowd, one eye always searching for his son. It was nearly 3:30 when James finally spotted him. Michael stood near the platform, deep in conversation with an older woman James didn't recognize. His son had grown a short beard, and his hair was longer than James remembered, but there was no mistaking those eyes, Diana's eyes, or the animated way he used his hands when he spoke passionately about something. James's heart pounded as he raised his camera, almost automatically, and captured his son in profile, the determined set of his jaw, the intensity in his expression. Then, lowering the camera, James began making his way toward Michael, unsure of what he would say after 3 years of silence, but knowing he had to try. He had closed half the distance when the first flashbang grenade went off. The crowd scattered in panic. James lost sight of Michael as people surged around him. More bangs followed, and then the acrid smell of tear gas began to fill the air. James pulled a bandana from his pocket, an old journalist's habit, and covered his nose and mouth. Through watering eyes, he raised his camera again, photographing the chaos as it unfolded, protesters fleeing, others standing their ground, police advancing with shields raised. "Michael!" James called out, his voice lost in the cacophony of shouts, sirens, and explosions. He pushed against the tide of people, trying to reach the spot where he'd last seen his son. The smoke grew thicker, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Then, through a momentary clearing in the crowd and smoke, James saw the elderly woman fall. She had been near Michael earlier, and now she was down, struggling to get up as people rushed past, some nearly trampling her. James raised his camera instinctively, then lowered it, conflicted about documenting someone's distress rather than helping. Before he could decide what to do, a figure pushed through the crowd toward the woman. Even through the smoke, James recognized his son. Michael knelt beside the woman, helping her sit up, clearly checking if she was injured. James raised his camera again, capturing the moment, his son's compassion amid chaos. As the police line advanced through the smoke, Michael looked up, seeming to make a decision. He helped the woman to her feet, then positioned himself between her and the approaching officers. James's finger pressed the shutter release button, again and again, documenting his son's bravery. The camera flash illuminated the chaos for just a fraction of a second. In that frozen moment, James Wilson saw everything with perfect clarity, his son lunging forward through the wall of smoke, arms outstretched toward the elderly woman who had fallen. The protest had turned violent just minutes before, and now tear gas clouded the air. James's finger pressed the shutter release again and again, his old photographer's instincts taking over despite the burning in his eyes and throat. Michael reached the woman, shielding her body with his own as the line of riot police advanced. James captured it all, the determination on his son's face, the relief of the woman, the ominous wall of shields and batons closing in. It was only when Michael turned, helping the woman to her feet, that James saw his face clearly. "Michael!" James whispered, his camera lowering slightly. The world seemed to stop. His son, his estranged son, was there in the middle of it all, staring back at him with equal shock. The officer's baton came down hard, catching Michael across the shoulders. He crumpled to his knees beside the woman he'd tried to save. James screamed his son's name, the camera falling to his chest as he lunged forward, only to be caught and restrained by other protesters. "Let me through, that's my son." James struggled against the hands holding him back as officers surrounded Michael and the woman. "Michael!" Now, back to where we started, in the chaotic heart of the protest. James broke free from the people holding him back and pushed forward toward the police line where Michael had fallen. His press pass still hung around his neck, and he held it up like a shield. "Press! I'm Press!" he shouted, knowing it might give him a better chance of getting through than identifying himself as the young man's father. An officer moved to block him, baton raised. "Stand back, sir," That man needs medical attention, James insisted, pointing toward Michael, who was still on his knees, one arm around the elderly woman, the other raised defensively. I'm a journalist. Let me document this. The officer hesitated, then stepped slightly aside. James rushed forward, camera already raised, documenting the scene even as he moved toward his son. Click, Michael looking up, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. Click, the woman beside him, her hand gripping Michael's arm, fear in her eyes. Click, the circle of officers, some looking uncertain, others determined. James reached them, kneeling beside Michael while continuing to take photos. Are you all right? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady, professional. Michael stared at him, recognition and confusion warring in his eyes. Dad, what are you doing here? Covering the protest, James replied, lowering his camera finally. Your mother told me you might be here. He turned to the elderly woman. Ma'am, are you hurt? She shook her head, though her breathing was labored. Just scared. This young man saved me. One of the officers stepped forward. Everyone needs to clear the area now. This has been declared an unlawful assembly. This woman needs medical attention, Michael said firmly, still supporting her weight. And I'm not leaving her. I'm not hurt, the woman insisted. Just help me get somewhere safe. James looked at the officer. The car is just a few blocks away. Let me take them both. The officer looked uncertain, glancing at his colleagues. Look, James said, holding up his press pass again. James Wilson, Tribune, this doesn't look good for your department. Officers striking a man who was helping an elderly woman. I've got it all on camera. Let me take them, and maybe this doesn't have to be tomorrow's front page. It wasn't strictly ethical journalism, but in that moment, James wasn't thinking as a journalist. He was thinking as a father. After a tense moment, the officer nodded. Get them out of here, now. James helped Michael support the woman as they made their way through the thinning crowd. The protest was breaking up as more tear gas filled the area, protesters retreating before the police advance. None of them spoke until they reached James's car, parked on a side street 3 blocks away. James opened the back door and Michael helped the woman into the seat. Only then did he turn to face his father directly. Bleeding, James said, reaching out instinctively toward the cut on Michael's forehead. Michael stepped back. It's nothing. His voice was cool, distant. 3 years of silence stretched between them like a chasm. We should get you both somewhere safe, James said, dropping his hand. What's your name, ma'am? Ruth Johnson, the woman said from the backseat. I'm a retired schoolteacher. I came out today because one of my former students was the man who was shot last week. She looked between James and Michael. You two know each other. He's my father, Michael said shortly, still looking at James with guarded eyes. I see, Ruth said, her tone suggesting she understood more than was being said. Well, Mr. Wilson, I'm grateful for your help, but I don't want to impose. If you could just drop me at the bus stop. Absolutely not, both men said simultaneously, then looked at each other in surprise. Mrs. Johnson, you've been through a traumatic experience, Michael continued. You should at least sit somewhere quiet for a while, have some water. My apartment is nearby. I could take you both there, James offered, then added carefully, if that's all right with you, Michael. Michael hesitated, then nodded curtly. Fine, it's on Maple Street, the Winchester Apartments. James didn't say that he already knew where his son lived. Diana had made sure of that, keeping tabs on Michael even during the years of estrangement. Instead, he just nodded and got into the driver's seat while Michael took the passenger side. As they drove away from the protest zone, sirens still wailing behind them, James felt the weight of the camera around his neck. The images he'd captured today, especially those of Michael protecting Ruth, could be powerful. Award-winning, even. But for the first time in his career, James wasn't thinking about publication. He was thinking about the young man sitting silently beside him, wondering if today might be a chance to bridge the gap that had grown between them. Your mother will be relieved to know you're all right, James said finally, breaking the tense silence in the car. You talked to Mom today? Michael asked, surprise evident in his voice. She called to tell me you might be at the protest, James explained. She was worried. She worries too much, Michael muttered, but there was no real irritation in his tone. That's what mothers do, Ruth chimed in from the backseat. My son is 45, and I still worry every time he drives in bad weather. She leaned forward slightly. So you're a photographer, Mr. Wilson? Photojournalist, James corrected automatically, though mostly I teach these days. Dad's work has been in Time, Newsweek, all the major papers, Michael said, surprising James with a hint of pride in his voice. He won a Pulitzer back in '68. Really? Ruth sounded impressed. For what picture? A boy facing down the National Guard during the riots after Dr. King was assassinated, James said, glancing briefly at Michael. He hadn't expected his son to remember, much less mention his achievements. I remember those days, Ruth said soberly. I was just a girl, but I remember the fear, the anger. Some things haven't changed as much as we'd hoped, have they? Neither man answered as James turned onto Maple Street and found a parking space near Michael's building. The three of them made their way slowly up to Michael's second-floor apartment, Ruth leaning on Michael's arm, James following with his camera bag. Michael's apartment was small but neat, with bookcases lining one wall and framed black and white photographs on another. James tried not to look too obviously, but he couldn't help noticing that one of the photos was his, a shot of Diana holding infant Michael at the beach, waves crashing behind them. "Please sit down, Mrs. Johnson," Michael said, guiding Ruth to the couch. "I'll get you some water. Dad, there's a first aid kit in the bathroom cabinet if you want to." He gestured vaguely toward his forehead, which had stopped bleeding but looked raw and swollen. James nodded and went to find the kit, giving himself a moment alone to process the surreal situation. 3 hours ago, he'd been preparing to photograph a protest. Now he was in his estranged son's apartment, the two of them acting almost normally around each other because of the buffer provided by a stranger. When he returned with the first aid kit, Michael was sitting beside Ruth on the couch, both of them holding glasses of water. "I've been telling your son that he should press charges," Ruth was saying firmly. "That officer had no right to strike him when he was clearly helping me." "It would be my word against theirs," Michael replied, taking the kit from James with a nod of thanks. "Unless there were witnesses willing to testify." "There's this," James said, touching his camera. "I got it all, the whole sequence." Michael looked up sharply. "You did," James nodded. "From the moment you went to help Mrs. Johnson until—" He trailed off, not wanting to say, "until you were struck down in front of Ruth." "May I see?" Ruth asked. "The pictures, I mean." James hesitated, looking at Michael. "Yes," Michael said after a moment. "I'd like to see them too." James connected his digital camera to Michael's television using an HDMI cable from his bag. The three of them sat side by side on the couch as James scrolled through the images from the protest. General crowd shots first, then the speeches, the first signs of tension between protesters and police. "That's when it started to get bad," Ruth commented as they viewed images of the first flashbang grenades going off. "I should have left then, but I wanted to stay until the end. My student's mother was supposed to speak." Then came the sequence with Michael and Ruth. Frame by frame, they watched as Michael spotted Ruth falling, pushed through the crowd to reach her, knelt beside her, helped her up, placed himself between her and the advancing police line. The final images showed the officer's baton raised, then coming down on Michael's shoulders, Michael falling to his knees. "Good Lord," Ruth whispered, reaching out to take Michael's hand. "You really were my guardian angel today." Michael looked uncomfortable with the praise. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Ruth said firmly. "They wouldn't have. People were running past me. You were the only one who stopped." James said nothing, but he felt a surge of pride so strong it nearly brought tears to his eyes. Whatever differences had come between them, his son was a good man. A brave man. The next images showed James himself rushing forward, confronting the police kneeling beside Michael. The sequence ended there. "These are powerful," Michael said quietly. "What will you do with them?" It was the question James had been asking himself since they'd left the protest. The journalist in him knew these images should be published. They told an important story about both police tactics and human compassion. But the father in him was reluctant to put his son in the spotlight, potentially making him a target for retaliation. "That depends," James said carefully. "What do you want me to do with them?" Michael looked surprised by the question. "Since when do you ask permission before publishing your work?" The question stung, but James recognized the pain behind it. "Since the subject is my son." Michael was quiet for a long moment, studying the frozen image on the screen, himself kneeling in the tear gas, one arm around Ruth, the other raised defensively. "Publish them," he said finally. "People need to see what happened today." Ruth nodded in agreement. "The truth should be told." James looked at his son with new respect. "Are you sure there could be consequences?" "Dad," Michael said with a hint of the old exasperation, "I'm a civil rights attorney. I know about consequences." He gestured toward the bookcase. "That's what all those law books are for." "A lawyer?" James couldn't hide his surprise. "I thought you were working for that nonprofit." "I still do pro bono work for them," Michael explained. "But I passed the bar 3 years ago. I have my own practice now, mostly civil rights cases." He paused. "Mom didn't tell you?" James shook his head. We don't talk about you much. It's too hard for her." An uncomfortable silence fell. Ruth, sensing the tension, stood up carefully. "I should be going," she said. "My daughter will be worried sick if she's seen the news." "I'll call you a cab," Michael offered, reaching for his phone. "Actually," Ruth said, "if it's not too much trouble, I'd rather Mr. Wilson drive me home. We older folks should stick together." She smiled at James. And I'd like to hear more about that Pulitzer-winning photograph. James recognized the transparent attempt to leave father and son alone together, but he appreciated the gesture. I'd be happy to drive you, Mrs. Johnson, but... He looked at Michael questioningly. Go ahead, Michael said, though he looked uncertain. But, Dad, will you come back afterward? We should talk. The simple request, so tentatively made, hit James like a physical blow. 3 years of silence, and now this chance, all because he'd been in the right place at the right time with his camera, just as he'd been so many times before in his career. I'll come back, James promised. He handed Michael a business card with his cell number. In case you need anything before I return. As he helped Ruth to the car, James felt lighter than he had in years. The weight of estrangement from his son hadn't disappeared, but for the first time he felt hope that it might eventually lift. In the car, Ruth was quiet at first, giving James time with his thoughts. Finally, as they turned onto the main boulevard, she spoke. He's a good man, your son? Yes, James agreed. He is. You must be very proud. James gripped the steering wheel tighter. I always have been, even when we weren't speaking. Ruth nodded wisely. May I ask what came between you? James hesitated, then decided this kind stranger deserved honesty. My work. I spent his childhood chasing stories around the world. I missed birthdays, school events. When he was 17, I missed his high school debate championship because I was covering hurricane aftermath in New Orleans. That must have been hard for him, Ruth observed. It was, but I thought he understood. I was documenting history, giving voice to people who needed it. James sighed. The final straw came 3 years ago. Michael had organized a community event, a panel discussion about police reform. He asked me to come take photographs. I agreed, but then there was a factory collapse in Bangladesh. My editor wanted me on a plane that night. And you went, Ruth guessed. James nodded. I went. Over 3,000 people died in that collapse. The world needed to see it, but when I got back... He trailed off, remembering the horrible argument that had followed, the words they'd both said that couldn't be taken back. He felt you'd chosen strangers over him. Again, Ruth supplied. Yes, James admitted. He said I cared more about documenting the world's problems than dealing with my own family's, and maybe he was right. They drove in silence for a few minutes, James following Ruth's directions to her daughter's house in the suburbs. You know, Ruth said finally, my late husband was a doctor, emergency room. He missed a lot of family moments too, saving strangers' lives. James glanced at her. How did your children handle that? Not always well, Ruth admitted. But as they got older, they came to understand that their father's work was important, not more important than them, but important in a different way. It took time. Time, James repeated. 3 years feels like a lot of time wasted. It's never too late to start again, Ruth said as James pulled up in front of a tidy bungalow. Especially when there's love underneath it all. And from the way he looked at that picture of you two on the wall, the one where you're teaching him to use a camera, I'd say there's still plenty of love there. James froze. What picture? Ruth looked confused. In his hallway, you and Michael when he was about 10, I'd guess. You're showing him how to hold a camera. James hadn't noticed the photograph, hadn't looked at the hallway. But now he remembered the day, a rare father-son outing to the zoo. Diana had taken the picture of James kneeling beside Michael, both of them holding James's old Nikon, their expressions mirror images of concentration. He kept that, James said softly, more to himself than to Ruth. People keep what matters to them, Ruth said, patting his hand. Remember that when you go back. After making sure Ruth was safely reunited with her concerned daughter, James drove back toward Michael's apartment. On the way, he called Diana. He's safe, he said as soon as she answered. Michael's fine. Thank God, Deanna breathed. I've been watching the news. They said people were hurt. He got a minor cut, but he's all right. I'm actually at his apartment. Well, heading back there now. There was a long pause. You're with Michael, actually talking to him. Yes, James said, still hardly believing it himself. It's a long story, but we've started talking again. James, that's wonderful, Deanna said, her voice thick with emotion. Tell him I love him, will you? I will, and Diana. James took a deep breath. Maybe we could all have dinner sometime, the three of us. Another pause, this one longer. I'd like that, she said finally. I'd like that very much. By the time James returned to Michael's apartment, evening had fallen. The street was quiet, the earlier chaos of the protest seeming far away. Michael answered the door immediately, as if he'd been waiting just inside. Mrs. Johnson get home all right? He asked, stepping back to let James enter. Safely delivered to her daughter, James confirmed. She's quite a lady. She is, Michael agreed. I'm glad I was able to help her. An awkward silence fell between them. James noticed the first aid kit was open on the coffee table, a bloody piece of gauze beside it. Your head, he said, gesturing toward the cut. Did you clean it properly? Michael touched the small bandage he'd applied. "It's fine, barely a scratch." Another silence. Then they both spoke at once. "I shoulda, would you?" They stopped, each waiting for the other to continue. "You first," James said. Michael gestured toward the kitchen. "I was just going to ask if you wanted coffee or something stronger." "Coffee would be great," James said, following his son into the small kitchen. As Michael busied himself with the coffee maker, James took the opportunity to look around more carefully. The apartment was modestly furnished but comfortable. Bookshelves overflowed with legal texts and historical works. On the refrigerator, held by magnets, were a few photographs: Michael with friends, a group shot of what looked like his colleagues at the law firm, and to James's surprise, a faded picture of Michael as a toddler on James's shoulders at a parade. Then James noticed the hallway Ruth had mentioned. Sure enough, prominently displayed was the photo of him teaching Michael to use a camera. Beside it was another he hadn't expected, James receiving his Pulitzer, a teenage Michael standing proudly beside him at the ceremony. "You kept these," James said softly, gesturing toward the photos when Michael turned around. Michael glanced at the wall, then back at the coffee maker. "Yeah, well, you're still my dad." The simple statement hit James like a punch to the heart. "Michael, let's sit down," Michael interrupted, carrying 2 mugs of coffee to the living room. James followed, sensing his son wasn't ready for an emotional conversation, standing up in the hallway. They sat on opposite ends of the couch where, just an hour earlier, they had reviewed the protest photographs with Ruth. "Mom sends her love," James said after taking a sip of the strong black coffee. "She was worried about you." Michael nodded. "I should call her." He set his mug down and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Dad, about today, thank you for being there. For helping me and Mrs. Johnson." "I was just doing my job," James said automatically, then winced at how that sounded exactly the kind of statement that had come between them before. But Michael surprised him with a small smile. "That's what I was doing too, my job as I see it, protecting people who need it." James looked at his son with new understanding. "We're not so different, are we?" "Maybe not in our goals," Michael admitted. "Just in our methods." He paused. "And maybe in how we balance work and family." The criticism was gentle but clear. James didn't try to defend himself. "I missed too much," he acknowledged. "I thought what I was doing was important enough to justify the sacrifices. Our sacrifices, I was wrong." Michael looked surprised at the admission. "Your work was important, Dad, is important. Those pictures you took, they show people what's happening in the world, make them care about places and people they might never see otherwise." He gestured toward the hallway photos. "Why do you think I kept those? I've always been proud of what you do." "Then why?" James began, confused. "Because I needed a father more than the world needed another picture," Michael said simply, "and sometimes it felt like you couldn't see that." The words hung between them, painful but true. James thought about all the moments he'd missed: soccer games, graduation parties, family dinners abandoned for breaking news. At the time, it had seemed like the right choice, the necessary sacrifice for important work. Now, looking at his son, he wasn't so sure. "I'm sorry," James said finally. "I made the wrong choices too many times." Michael was quiet for a long moment. "The thing is, Dad, I understand better now. My work takes me away sometimes, too. Last month, I missed Tasha's birthday dinner because a client was arrested at a protest and needed representation immediately." "Tasha?" James asked, realizing how little he knew about his son's life now. "My girlfriend, we've been together about a year." Michael smiled slightly. "Mom's met her, she approves." "I'd like to meet her too," James said carefully. "If that would be all right." Michael nodded. "She'd like that. She's seen your work. She's a photography buff herself." Another silence fell, but this one felt less tense, more contemplative. "What will happen with those photos?" Michael asked eventually. "The ones from today." James had been thinking about this during the drive. "I'll submit them to the Tribune with your permission. They tell an important story about police tactics, but also about human compassion in chaos." He paused. "Your compassion." "It wasn't a calculated act," Michael admitted. "I just saw her fall and reacted." "That's often when the most powerful photographs happen," James said. "When people are simply being their authentic selves in extraordinary moments." He hesitated, then added, "I'll make sure the Tribune's lawyers review everything before publication. I won't let this create problems for you." "I appreciate that," Michael said, "but the truth should be told, whatever the consequences." James felt another surge of pride in his son's principles. "You're a good man, Michael. Your mother and I did something right." "Mom did most of the heavy lifting," Michael said, but he was smiling slightly. "You provided the moral compass when you were around." It was as close to forgiveness as James could hope for at this point, and he accepted it gratefully. "I'd like to be around more now if you'll let me." Michael met his father's gaze directly. "I'd like that too." Later that night, after they'd talked for hours about Michael's law practice, James's teaching, the years they'd missed in each other's lives, James drove home to his empty apartment. But it felt less empty somehow, as if the reconnection with his son had filled a space that had been vacant for too long. He transferred the day's photographs to his computer and began the careful process of selection and minimal editing. The sequence of Michael and Ruth told a powerful story all by itself. James kept returning to one image in particular, Michael shielding Ruth from the approaching officers, his face determined and compassionate at once. It was, James realized, the best work he'd done in years, not because of the composition or timing, but because of the truth it captured about the human capacity for courage and care in the face of danger. The next morning, James submitted the photos to the Tribune with a short article explaining the context. By noon, the editor had called, excited by the powerful images and story. "This is front-page material, James," she said. Especially with the legal angle, the son of a renowned photojournalist, now a civil rights attorney, caught in the act of protecting an elderly protester. It humanizes the whole situation. "Just make sure the legal department reviews it thoroughly," James insisted. "I don't want my son facing repercussions." "Already done," the editor assured him. "They say we're on solid ground with these. The public interest in police conduct at protests gives us strong protection." The story ran the following day, dominating the front page with the image of Michael shielding Ruth. The headline read, "Compassion amid chaos. Attorney protects elderly woman during protest crackdown." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Other news outlets picked up the story. Michael's phone began ringing nonstop with interview requests. Ruth Johnson was interviewed on local television, praising her guardian angel and condemning the police response. By the end of the week, the police department had announced an investigation into the conduct of officers at the protest. The officer who had struck Michael was placed on administrative leave pending review. The mayor issued a statement promising reforms in how protests were handled. Through it all, James watched with a mixture of pride and concern as his son handled the sudden attention with grace and purpose, using the platform to speak about the broader issues of police accountability and civil rights. "You've started something important," James told Michael when they met for dinner that Friday, along with Diana and Tasha. It was the first time in years the family had been together, and the first time James had met his son's girlfriend, a smart, passionate journalist who reminded James of Diana in her younger years. "We started it," Michael corrected, including his father in the achievement. "Your photographs made people pay attention." Diana, who had been quiet for much of the meal, watching her husband and son interact with wonder and relief, reached out to take James's hand. "You two always were a force when you worked together," she said. "I remember when Michael was little how you used to let him choose subjects for you to photograph." "Cloud shapes," Michael remembered, smiling. "I was obsessed with clouds that looked like animals." "You had a good eye even then," James said. "You saw things others missed." "Wonder where I got that from," Michael replied, the gentle teasing in his voice a balm to years of hurt. After dinner, as they stood outside the restaurant saying their goodbyes, Michael surprised James by pulling him into a tight hug. "Thank you," he whispered, "for being there that day, for seeing me." James held his son close, feeling the years of distance dissolving. "I've always seen you, Michael, I just didn't show it enough." As James drove Diana home afterward, she had agreed to coffee at his apartment, a small step toward their own reconciliation. She turned to him with tears in her eyes. "When you called me that day, telling me you were with Michael, I hardly dared hope for this," she said. "Having our family back together, even just for a dinner." "It's a start," James said, "not an end." "What happens now?" Diana asked. "With the photographs, with Michael's sudden fame." James thought about the calls he'd been getting himself, from galleries interested in exhibiting the protest series, from journalism schools asking him to speak, from publishers suggesting a book of his life's work. "I don't know exactly," he admitted, "but whatever happens, I'm not missing any more family dinners." 2 months later, James stood in a small gallery downtown, surrounded by his photographs from the protest and from throughout his career. The exhibition, titled Moments of Truth, had been Tasha's idea, a retrospective of James's work paired with new images, including the now famous series of Michael protecting Ruth. The gallery was crowded with journalists, photographers, students, and friends. In one corner, Michael stood with Ruth Johnson and her extended family, laughing at something her grandson had said. In another, Diana chatted with Robert Thompson and other colleagues from James's long career. James moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and answering questions about his work. But his attention kept returning to the central wall, where the largest photograph hung, Michael shielding Ruth, his face illuminated by the camera flash in that frozen moment of chaos and compassion. A young photography student approached, notebook in hand. "Mr. Wilson, can I ask you a question for my school paper?" "Of course," James replied, smiling at the young woman's earnestness. "Of all the historic moments you've captured, wars, natural disasters, political upheavals, is there one that stands out as most meaningful to you personally?" James didn't hesitate, pointing to the photograph of Michael. "That one, without question." "Because it's your son?" the student asked. "Yes," James acknowledged, "but not just because it's my son. Because it reminds me why I became a photojournalist in the first place, to show the truth about who we are as human beings at our worst and at our best. And sometimes, if we're lucky, we get to be present for moments of extraordinary grace." The student nodded, writing quickly. "One more question. The title of the exhibition is Moments of Truth. What's the truth you hope people take away from these images?" James looked around the gallery at the faces of his family and friends, at the strangers moved by the photographs on the walls, at the image of his son's courage. "That connection matters more than documentation," he said finally. "That the most important stories aren't always in far-off places. Sometimes they're right in front of us, in the people we love." As the evening wound down, James found himself standing before the central photograph with Michael, Diana, and Ruth. "You know," Ruth said thoughtfully, "when I woke up that morning, I never imagined I'd end up in an art gallery 2 months later looking at a picture of myself, or that I'd gain a whole new extended family." She smiled at the Wilsons. "Life changes in an instant sometimes," Diana said, slipping her hand into James's. They had been seeing each other regularly since the reconnection, with Michael slowly rebuilding what had been broken. "Sometimes it takes a moment of crisis to see what really matters," Michael added, looking meaningfully at his father. James nodded, thinking of all the moments his camera had captured over the decades, moments of tragedy and triumph, of suffering and celebration. But none had changed his own life as profoundly as the moment he'd seen his son through his viewfinder, stepping forward to protect a stranger when others fled. "The trick," James said, "is recognizing those moments when they come and not letting them slip away." Later that night, after the gallery had closed and the four of them, James, Diana, Michael, and Tasha, had gone for a late dinner, James found himself thinking about the chain of events that had brought them to this point. If Diana hadn't called that day to warn him Michael would be at the protest, if he hadn't spotted his son in the crowd, if the protest hadn't turned violent, if he hadn't had his camera ready at that precise moment. So many chance occurrences, so many small decisions leading to one transformative moment. As a photojournalist, James had always understood the power of split-second timing. Now he understood its power in life as well. The following week, the mayor's office called. They wanted to honor both Michael and Ruth at a community ceremony, highlighting their story as an example of courage and compassion during difficult times. The police reforms Michael had been advocating for years were finally gaining serious consideration. "Will you be there?" Michael asked his father when he called to share the news. "Try and keep me away," James replied. "But this time I'll leave the camera at home." "Actually," Michael said, "I was hoping you'd bring it. Document the moment. It's what you do best, Dad." James felt a lump form in his throat at his son's words. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," Michael said firmly. "Just promise you'll put the camera down afterward and join us on stage when they call your name too." "My name? Why would they call my name?" "Because," Michael explained, "I told them the story doesn't work without you. Without your photographs, it would have just been another protest incident, forgotten in a day. You made people see. You made people care." At the ceremony the following month, James did as his son asked, photographed the event, captured the mayor shaking hands with Michael and Ruth, documented the announcement of new police training protocols and community oversight measures. And when they called his name, he handed his camera to Tasha and joined his son and Ruth on stage, accepting the city's recognition for photojournalism that had sparked important dialogue and positive change. As they stood together before the applauding crowd, Ruth leaned over to whisper, "Did you ever imagine this outcome when you headed downtown that day?" James shook his head, watching Diana beaming proudly from the front row. "Never. I thought I was just going to take some pictures of a protest." "Instead, you got your family back," Ruth said. "And made a new friend," James added, smiling at the remarkable woman who had become an unlikely bridge between father and son. As the applause continued, James looked out at the crowd, thinking of all the moments he'd witnessed through his viewfinder over the decades. Wars and weddings, triumphs and tragedies, the full spectrum of human experience frozen in fractions of seconds. But the most important moment of all had been when he'd lowered that camera and truly seen his son, not as a subject to be documented, but as a man to be known, to be reconnected with, to be loved. Some things James had finally learned couldn't be captured on film. They had to be lived. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.